Budgets. We hear that word and, sometimes our eyes just glaze over. It seems like just spreadsheets and numbers, right?
Mm-hmm. Dry stuff, usually.
But if you actually pull back the curtain, you find this intense debate, really difficult choices, legal battles even, and consequences that, well, they ripple through everyone's lives.
Absolutely. And if any recent budget process in South Africa has shown just how dramatic these financial blueprints can be, it's got to be the journey to the 2025 budget.
It really has been far from predictable, hasn't it?
Oh, completely. I mean, it's involved political maneuvering, unexpected court challenges, and a pretty rapid shift in approach that, frankly, few could have predicted. It really shines a light on the pressures of managing a national economy.
And getting legislation passed, yeah.
Exactly.
And that's precisely what we're doing a deep dive into today, all those unexpected twists and turns of South Africa's 2025 budget process.
And we've got the key sources lined up. We've got the official budget speech from March 12th, then the revised one from May 21st, and crucially, a legal alert that details the court challenges and, well, the surprising events in between.
Right. So our goal here is to unpack this whole complex story for you. We'll start with how the budget process usually works in South Africa.
Sort of the normal way.
Then look at that first budget tabled in March, what was in it, why it got challenged so heavily. Then we'll examine, what happened next, how it had to be revised, and what this final version looks like.
And of course, what it all potentially means for you, the listener, the citizen.
Okay, so let's lay the groundwork first. How does the South African budgeting process generally unfold based on our sources?
So the process really kicks off when the Minister of Finance tables a set of critical documents before Parliament.
Right, that's both the National Assembly and the NCAP.
Correct, both houses. And these documents are essentially the blueprint. You've got the Division of Revenue Bill.
Which splits the money.
Yeah, how money is divided between national, provincial, and local government. Then the Appropriation Bill, which details where the national pot of money goes, and the revenue laws bills, which cover all the tax changes.
Okay, so those are the core bits of legislation needed to actually make the budget happen.
Exactly. Once they're tabled, parliamentary committees get to work.
Okay.
You've got the Standing Committee on Finance, the Select Committee on Finance.
They dig into the details.
They do. They scrutinize key aspects, including the fiscal framework. That's the really important bit, setting the overall spending and revenue limits. They produce reports on these, and then Parliament votes to accept those reports.
So it's a system designed for oversight, for legislative approval before it all becomes law.
That's the idea, legislative buy-in.
Got it. So Parliament has that essential approval role. But what about tax changes? Specifically, say, a change to the VAT rate. Can the government introduce that and have it apply before Parliament finishes the whole process with the bills?
Well, this is where a specific bit of law, and frankly, the core of the drama we're about to unpack comes in. According to the sources, Section 7.4 of the VAT Act allows the Minister of Finance to announce a change to the VAT rate.
Just announce it.
Announce it, yes. And for that change to legally come into effect immediately from the date the minister specifies in that announcement.
Whoa. So just the minister making an announcement under that specific section can change the tax rate, like, right away. That sounds incredibly powerful.
It is a significant mechanism. Now,
okay, that mechanism is crucial background. Now let's rewind to the start of this year's process. The budget tabling itself was delayed initially, wasn't it?
That's right. The minister's speech on March 12th actually kicked off by mentioning that the tabling had been postponed 3 weeks earlier. So the original date would have been around February 19th.
And did he say why? What was the reason given for that delay?
He described it, interestingly, as a regrettable but perhaps an understandable feature of multi-party governance. He sort of suggested it was linked to allowing more public debate and, consideration of policy trade-offs, implying the political situation needed more time for discussion or consensus before they could present the final budget.
Interesting framing, pointing to the political reality. So after that initial delay, the March 12th budget finally landed. What was the vision?
It was presented as a bold and pragmatic approach. The core focus areas were achieving macroeconomic stability, really driving structural reforms to boost growth, improving the state's capability for better service delivery, and significantly accelerating infrastructure investment.
All right, let's deep dive into that March 12th plan, before things took a turn. What were the key numbers? The fiscal strategy, the economic outlook.
Okay, so the central promise was a balanced fiscal approach.
Yeah.
The plan projected achieving a budget primary surplus, that means revenue exceeding non-interest spending of 0.5% of GDP in this current 2024-25 financial year.
Okay.
And that was set to rise to 0.9% in 2025-26.
Yeah.
Government debt was projected to stabilize at 76.2% of GDP in 2025-26.
Stabilization, that's always a key target.
Always. And the overall consolidated budget deficit was planned to narrow down to 3.5% of GDP by 2027-28.
Stabilizing debt is one thing, but those debt service costs, the interest payments, they sound massive.
They absolutely are, and the minister was very blunt about it. The projection was our $389.6 billion just to service debt in this financial year. He really hammered home that this works out to 22 cents of every single rand the government collects in revenue. And crucially, he pointed out, it was more than the combined spending on health, police, and basic education.
More than all three combined. Good grief.
Yeah. So the budget's fiscal strategy was explicitly aimed at reversing that trend, trying to free up money for essential services. That 22 cents figure, it really paints a stark picture.
It certainly does. And on the economic growth side, what was the outlook back in March?
Well, the budget acknowledged the tough decade we've had, growth averaging less than 2%. The projection for 2024 was pretty modest, but the hope was to average 1.8% over the medium term. The growth strategy and infrastructure investment were really positioned as key to lifting that.
So what did that growth strategy actually involve? You mentioned structural reforms, infrastructure.
Yes, the plan rested on four main pillars: macro stability, those structural reforms, state capability, and infrastructure. A big part of the reform push was Operation Volundale.
Ah, yes, OV. The initiative to speed up key economic reforms.
Exactly. And the speech highlighted some Phase 1 successes, things like enabling a big pipeline of energy projects outside of ESCOM,
Important.
finalizing the freight logistics roadmap to get private players involved in ports and rail, bringing down data costs significantly, clearing backlogs and water licenses, improving water quality monitoring, and rolling out e-visas for 34 countries to boost tourism.
Okay, so some tangible progress cited there. What about Phase 2?
Phase 2 of OV was set to build on that. The focus areas mentioned were seen through the existing reforms, bolstering local government capacity, improving digital infrastructure, and fostering more inclusive cities.
And infrastructure spending itself. It was described as the fastest growing area.
It was. Over R1 trillion was earmarked for public infrastructure investment over the next 3 years.
$1 trillion rand. Where was that mainly going?
Key sectors highlighted were transport and logistics, getting R402 billion. That included R100 billion for Sandrail's road network, and R19.2 billion provisionally set aside for process signaling upgrades. That's to improve train frequency. Energy was set to receive R219.2 billion, and water and sanitation R156.3 billion, with specific big projects like Mkomazi and Berg River Volvlay getting a mention.
And how was this huge infrastructure push going to be funded, especially getting the private sector involved?
Yeah, reforms aimed at boosting private sector participation were central. New public-private partnership, or PPP, regulations were finalized, set to kick in on June 1st, 2025.
Okay.
The Budget Facility for Infrastructure, the BFI, was being reconfigured to run multiple bid windows quarterly, trying to pipeline projects faster. And alternative financing tools were also planned, like a credit guarantee vehicle in 2026 and issuing the first government infrastructure bond in 2025-26.
Right, so a multi-pronged approach to funding, okay, that covers the spending side, focused on growth and infrastructure. Now, the big question, to pay for all this, especially with the ongoing pressures on services, where was the significant new money coming from in that March budget?
And this brings us directly to the proposal that, well, generated so much heat and ultimately the legal challenge. The minister acknowledged these persistent spending needs: health, education, transport, security, you name it. To help fund this, the key revenue proposal was an increase in the VAT rate.
The VAT hike, the one everyone was talking about, what were the specifics again?
The plan was to increase the value-added tax rate from the current 15% up to 15.5%, effective May 1st, 2025, and then a further step up to 16%, effective April 1st, 2026.
A two-step increase. And were there any sort of counterbalancing adjustments elsewhere, like to income tax brackets to account for inflation?
No. That was notable. The budget explicitly proposed no inflationary adjustments to personal income tax brackets, rebates, or medical tax credits.
So fiscal drag, basically. People effectively pay a bit more tax as their incomes rise with inflation.
Exactly, meaning individuals would effectively pay slightly more tax over time anyway. So the VAT hike was the main lever for raising significant new funds.
How much were they expecting to raise from it, and what was the justification?
The two-step increase was projected to bring in R28 billion in 2025-26 and another R14.5 billion in 2026-27. The minister framed it as a difficult but necessary decision.
Hmm.
He argued it raised needed revenue, was less harmful economically than hiking corporate or income taxes given our relatively high rates already.
Right.
It allowed the government to avoid deeper spending cuts, and crucially, it enabled the extension of the social wage to support vulnerable households. He did say alternatives were looked at, and VAT was chosen as the, quote, best option in their view.
Okay, but VAT increases often hit lower-income households hardest. How did the March budget plan to cushion that impact?
Right, that's always a major concern. Specific measures were included. Social grants were set to increase by amounts above projected inflation, which was key.
Okay.
And crucially, the basket of VAT zero-rated food items, those essentials exempt from VAT, was proposed to be expanded from May 1st, 2025.
What kinds of items were going to be added?
Things like canned vegetables, certain dairy liquid blends, and edible offal from various animals were listed to be added to that zero-rated list. Additionally, the general fuel levy wasn't going to be increased for another year, saving consumers an estimated $4 billion.
Okay, so a significant tax increase, but paired with some specific cushioning measures. What about SARS's role in all this, getting the money in?
Yeah, SARS was allocated extra funding $3.5 billion in the current year and another $4 billion over the medium term. This was aimed at boosting its efficiency, improving collections from outstanding debt, and bringing more non-filers into the tax net. The minister really stressed the importance of tax compliance.
Makes sense. Okay, turning to the spending priorities in that March budget. Where was the proposed additional $232.6 billion over the 3-year MTEF, the medium-term expenditure framework, actually going?
Right. The MTEF is the government's 3-year spending plan. That additional $232.6 billion was allocated to tackle critical pressures in key service areas.
Like health.
Yes. Health was getting $28.9 billion added. This was partly to address staff losses, the speech mentioned, nearly 9,000 workers lost in large accruals. The goal was to retain nearly 9,300 workers and employ 800 new doctors after their community service.
And education.
Education received $19.1 billion extra, aimed at helping keep around 11,000 teachers in classrooms, addressing teacher ratios.
ECD also got a boost, right? Early childhood development.
A significant one, an additional $10 billion over the MTEF. This was planned to increase the per-child subsidy from $17 up to $24 per day and expand access for about 700,000 more children up to age 4. Social Security was obviously a major focus too, allocated $284.7 billion just in 2025-26. The grant increases were specified. Old age disability grants up by $130 to $23.15 in April. The child support grant up by $30 to $560 per month. Foster care up by $70.
And the SRD grant, the COVID relief grant.
That was extended for another year, until the end of March 2026, with $35.2 billion allocated. And importantly, a review was announced, due by September 2025, to look at options for more sustainable income support, possibly linking it to employment or job seeking.
Okay. What about peace and security?
$9.4 billion was allocated to defense and correctional services. This included $5 billion over the MTEF period, specifically for the SAEC mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Right.
The speech also sort of listed several other areas needing funding down the line that couldn't be fully covered yet. Things like infrastructure projects, dealing with population changes, strengthening justice and stats essay, party funding, support for royal houses, a whole list of pressures.
A very detailed plan, then, funded significantly by that VAT increase. What about the third pillar you mentioned, building state capability? What did that involve?
This is all about improving government effectiveness and efficiency. Reforms included acting on recommendations from spending reviews. Apparently, 240 have been done since 2013. Also, auditing payrolls to find ghost workers in national and provincial departments, reviewing and rationalizing public employment programs, and tweaking budget process assumptions.
And things like conditional grants.
Yes, work was underway there too. Implementing the first phase of reforms, like merging some grants and making others performance-based, especially for the big city metros. Disaster resilience was also mentioned, with funds set aside for future events and clearing backlogs, plus trying to cut red tape for emergency funds.
What about local government? Always a challenge.
Definitely. The plan included reviewing the structure of local government, looking at the fiscal framework, and reforming municipal revenue services, things like ring-fencing funds for specific services and helping them generate operating surpluses.
Okay, so that paints a clear picture of the March 12th plan. Ambitious spending increases, particularly in key services and infrastructure, largely bankrolled by that phased-in VAT hike. But, as we know, the story took a sharp turn.
It certainly did. Which brings us neatly to Act 3, the challenge, the reversal, and ultimately the court order.
Right. Let's unpack that. Remember Section 7.4 of the VAT Act we talked about?
The one allowing the immediate effect.
Exactly. By announcing that VAT rate change on March 12th for those future dates in 2025 and 2026, that increase, legally speaking, came into effect the moment the minister announced it, just effective from those future dates, because of that specific law.
So it wasn't just a proposal floating out there waiting for Parliament. It had immediate legal force, just time for the future.
Precisely. And that's why the legal challenge that followed was so critical and so urgent. On April 22nd, the High Court heard an urgent application. This was brought by the Democratic Alliance, the DA, and the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF.
Okay, what were they challenging specifically?
They were challenging resolutions that had already been passed by Parliament, by both the National Assembly and the NCOP, which accepted the report on the 2025 fiscal framework.
So they weren't just targeting the VAT increase itself, but the parliamentary sign-off on the whole budget framework that contained it.
Correct. And the DA, in their application, also specifically asked the court to suspend the minister's decision to increase the VAT rate based on his March announcement. And even further, they wanted Section 7.4 of the VAT Act itself declared unconstitutional.
Wow, okay. That escalated fast, challenging the very legal mechanism allowing the immediate tax effect.
Yeah.
How did the minister and the government react to this legal pressure cooker?
The response was remarkably swift. Very early on April 24th, just 2 days after the hearing started, the minister issued a media statement. He announced that, given the court case and after consultations, he would introduce a new rates bill. And this new bill would propose keeping the VAT rate at 15% from May 1st.
So a complete U-turn, reversing the planned increase entirely.
Effectively, yes. A notice for this new rates bill was given later that same day, April 24th, and the original notice about the VAT increase for March was formally withdrawn.
So just weeks after proposing it, he pulled it back.
Yes. And the gazetted version of this new rates bill explicitly stated that, despite the minister's previous announcement under Section 7.4, the change to the VAT rate would not come into effect.
But was there still some legal gray area around this rapid reversal? Could he just withdraw an announcement made under Section 7.4 like that?
Well, according to our sources, that was part of the uncertainty. While Section 7.4 allows an announced rate change to apply for up to 12 months, it doesn't explicitly spell out a clear legal process for withdrawing such an announcement once it's been made and technically taken effect, even if for a future date.
Ah, I see. So that ambiguity added to the need for the court to step in and provide definite clarity.
Exactly. It contributed to the need for a court order to settle the matter definitively.
How did SARS, the tax agency, handle this sudden flip-flop, especially with May 1st, the original increase date, looming large?
Yeah, it must have caused some practical headaches. On April 25th, the SARS commissioner issued guidance for vendors. They were told to keep charging 15% VAT from May 1st.
For businesses whose systems were maybe already changing to 15.5%, SARS allowed a temporary reporting workaround at that rate until May 15th. But they strongly urged vendors to switch back to 15% before May 1st if possible, and provided steps for adjustments. It really highlights the scramble caused by all the uncertainty.
And all this was happening before Parliament could actually pass the new rates bill confirming the 15% rate, right? Didn't that mean the original VAT increase announced under Section 7.4 was still technically legally set to happen on May 1st unless something stopped it?
That's precisely the point. That was the critical legal cliffhanger.
Yeah.
The Section 7.4 announcement still arguably had legal force pending Parliament's vote on the new bill. So, to prevent the increase from automatically kicking in on May 1st.
The DA went back to court.
Yes, they filed a supplementary affidavit on April 25th. They specifically asked the High Court for an order to stop the increase from happening on the planned date.
And how was this final legal standoff resolved? Did it go to a full judgment?
No, it didn't need to. The parties involved the government side, Minister and Parliament, and the applicants, DA and EFF, actually reached a settlement agreement.
Oh.
And the terms of that settlement were then formally made an order of the High Court. This court order is what provided the crucial legal certainty. The VAT rate increase announced in March would not come into effect on May 1st, 2025.
What were the key points of that binding court order based on the settlement?
It did two main things. First, it formally suspended the minister's March 12th announcement under Section 7.4 that sought to increase VAT. This suspension would last until either new legislation regulating the VAT rate was passed, i.e. the new rates bill keeping it at 15%, or until the court made a final decision on the constitutionality of Section 7.4 itself, whichever came first.
Okay, so it put the brakes on the increase. What was the second thing?
Second, the court order formally set aside the resolutions that had been passed by the National Assembly and the NCKP back on April 2nd, where they accepted the report on the 2025 fiscal framework.
So it effectively wiped the slate clean, undid the parliamentary approval for the original budget framework.
That's the practical impact, yes. The court also awarded legal costs to the DA and the EFF. And importantly, the DA specifically kept its right to continue pursuing its separate legal challenge about whether Section 7.4 itself is constitutional, even though the immediate VAT increase issue was resolved by the suspension.
Got it. So what happened to the plan to expand the list of zero-rated food items? That was linked to the VAT increase, wasn't it?
It was. And since the VAT increase itself was suspended and effectively reversed, the proposed expansion of the zero-rated food basket announced back in March was also withdrawn.
Ah, okay.
The reasoning was that the expansion didn't have a legal basis until Parliament formally approved it through legislation, and its whole rationale was tied directly to cushioning the impact of the VAT increase that was no longer happening. So VAT stays at 15%, but those extra zero-rated items also fell away.
Wow. That's a major shift from the original March plan. So with the initial fiscal framework basically nullified by the court and the main revenue-raising plan reversed, the minister had to go back to the drawing board and table a whole new revised budget.
Exactly right. And that brings us to the May 21st budget. Minister Enoch Godongwana tabled this revised budget, and his speech explicitly reflected on the debate, the uncertainty, and the decision to keep VAT at 15%. He framed it as being responsive, listening to South Africans and political parties.
And what did he say was the direct consequence of dropping that VAT increase from a funding point of view?
He was quite upfront about it. He stated that removing the VAT hike from the plan without finding an immediate equivalent new source of revenue, quote, significantly reduced our ability to fund additional government programs and projects to the extent we had deemed necessary back in March.
So simply put, less money available for those extra spending priorities they'd identified.
Yes, specifically for the additional funding allocations above the baseline budgets. However, he was very quick to emphasize that this revised budget is not an austerity budget.
Okay.
He pointed out that non-interest spending is still set to increase by an average of 5.4% over the next 3 years. That's about 0.8% real growth after you factor in inflation. And he highlighted that 61 cents of every rand spent will still go towards the social wage sorts, things like education, health, social grants.
So the core spending continues, but the planned expansion is curtailed. How did the overall fiscal strategy and economic outlook shift in this May budget compared to March?
The core commitment to a balanced strategy, sustainable finances, investing in growth, the rhetoric remained. But the numbers did shift slightly. Government debt is now projected to stabilize at 77.4% GDP in 2025-26.
Hang on, wasn't it 76.2% projected in March?
It was. So that's 1.2 percentage points higher. Yeah. The minister attributed this increase mainly to lower projections for nominal GDP rather than higher borrowing. The main budget deficit is actually projected to decrease by $8 billion over the MTF compared to the March estimates, and the primary surplus is still expected to expand steadily, reaching 2.1% by 2027-28.
But even a 1.2% higher debt stabilization level, that translates into billions more in debt down the line, surely.
Precisely. It might sound small as a percentage, but on a national scale, it means billions more in future interest payments, further squeezing the fiscal space available for everything else. And speaking of debt costs, they remain incredibly high, projected over our $1.3 trillion over 3 years. That's our $1.2 billion per day just on interest in 2025-26. Reducing this burden is still flagged as a major priority.
And the economic outlook itself, was that revised?
Yes, and unfortunately it was revised downwards in the May budget compared to March. The global outlook is seen as worse, and domestically, real GDP growth is now estimated at a lower 1.4% for 2025.
Down from 1.9% in March.
Correct. And the projections for 2026 and 2027 are also slightly lower now at 1.6% and 1.8% respectively. The minister noted significant risks remain elevated.
Okay, so a weaker growth forecast, slightly higher projected debt levels. What about the revenue side now that the VAT increase is off the table and the zero-rated expansion is gone too?
Well, with VAT staying at 15% and the zero-rated expansion canceled, tax revenue projections had to be revised down. They're now expected to be $61.9 billion lower over the next 3 years compared to what was estimated back in March.
$61.9 billion lower, that's a substantial haul.
It is. It reflects both the VAT reversal and that weaker economic outlook we just mentioned.
Was any new tax proposed in the May budget to try and plug some of that $61.9 billion gap immediately?
Yes, but only one new tax proposal was specifically mentioned for the 2025-26 financial year in this revised budget.
What was it?
An inflation-linked increase to the general fuel levy. It's the first time the fuel levy's been increased in 3 years. From June 4th, it adds 16 cents per liter for petrol and 15 cents per liter for diesel.
That sounds, well, relatively small compared to a R61.9 billion shortfall over 3 years. Will that alone close the gap?
No, definitely not. The minister was clear about that. He stated that this fuel levy increase alone isn't enough. He explicitly said that the 2026 budget, next year's budget, will need to propose new tax measures specifically aimed at raising our $20 billion.
Ah, so the need for more revenue hasn't vanished. It's just been kicked down the road slightly.
Essentially, yes.
Yep.
Postponed until the next budget cycle.
How is SARS expected to contribute? Is there hope they can find some of this money without new taxes?
Well, SARS did receive an increased allocation in the May budget compared to what was mentioned in March. An additional R7.5 billion over the MTEF period, up from the R4 billion mentioned for March.
Okay.
A big focus for this extra funding is increasing SARS's effectiveness in collecting outstanding tax debts. The potential here is estimated quite widely between R20 billion and R50 billion per year.
That's a huge range.
It is. But there's a specific target mentioned. Collecting R35 billion annually from these efforts. The idea is that achieving this could help offset that future need for R20 billion in new taxes. The funding is also for modernization and fighting illicit trade. And again, the call for better tax compliance from everyone was strongly reiterated.
Right. Let's look at the revised spending priorities in May. You mentioned less available for additional spending. The March budget had R232.6 billion extra over the MTEF. What was the figure in May?
The total allocated non-interest spending over the MTEF in the May budget is R6.69 trillion. The additional spending included on top of the baseline budgets now amounts to our $180.1 billion over the 3 years.
So our $180.1 billion compared to our $232.6 billion in March, that's a reduction of our $68 billion in planned additional spending.
That's correct, our $68 billion difference. The minister clarified that these reductions primarily came from trimming provisional allocations money that hadn't been firmly assigned to specific projects yet. He stated that the baseline funding for national, provincial, and local government remained largely unchanged.
So the core budgets for existing functions weren't drastically slashed, but the planned expansion and funding for new initiatives had to be scaled back because of the lost VAT revenue.
That seems to be the implication. To really drive home the point that critical needs remain despite the tighter constraints, the minister actually shared a very powerful excerpt in his speech.
Oh, what was that?
It was from a letter written by a medical student, Sarah Stein. She described the incredibly difficult conditions in some public hospitals, mentioning things like having no gloves available in a delivery room, waiting times for essential scans stretching for months, and doctors being forced into impossible choices about whose life is worth saving more.
Wow, that really brings the abstract numbers down to a very stark human level.
It does. He used it to emphasize that the budget, even this revised one with less additional funding, still aims to address these absolutely critical needs on the ground.
How were specific allocations in key areas like health and education affected in the final May budget then?
Despite the overall reduction in that additional funding pool, many of the key priorities identified in March were still accommodated, though maybe with slightly adjusted figures. Provincial education still received R9.5 billion added to its baseline, still aimed at keeping or hiring teachers.
And ECD.
The additional R10 billion for early childhood development was maintained, still aimed at increasing that subsidy from R17 to R24 per child per day and expanding access for 700,000 children, the May speech mentioned up to age 5 specifically.
Okay. Wow.
Provincial health received R20.8 billion added to its baseline. This was allocated for employing 800 post-community service doctors, ensuring essential goods and services, reducing those accruals or unpaid bills, and addressing personnel costs. So still significant additional funding, perhaps slightly less than originally envisaged, but substantial. Social Security grants were also still set to increase. The May speech gave a bit more detail on the old age and disability grants. R120 added in April, taking it to R2310, plus another R10 added in October, bringing the total to R2320.
Okay, so a slight tweak in the phasing.
Yes. The SRD grant extension to March 2026 was confirmed, and that review by September 2025 to possibly integrate it with employment opportunities is still on the cards.
What about the DRC deployment funding?
That was reconfigured because of the planned withdrawal of troops. The R5 billion MTEF amount mentioned in March was reduced. Instead, R3 billion was specifically allocated just for 2025-26 to cover the costs associated with that withdrawal.
Makes sense. Any other notable changes?
R 1.4 billion was allocated for the upcoming local government elections, split between the IEC and security support from police and SANDF. Those provisional allocations we mentioned, the unassigned funds, were retained, but, as expected, at a slightly lower level than hoped for in March due to the smaller pot of additional money. The list of spending pressures still needing funding later remained largely the same, and the possibility of Transnet guarantee support was still mentioned.
So it sounds like core commitments were largely protected, but the room for major expansion or new programs was definitely constrained by that R68 billion revenue shortfall from the VAT decision. What about spending efficiencies and state capability in the May version? Was the approach the same?
Pretty much the same strategy, yes. Balancing fiscal discipline with investing in growth by prioritizing high-impact spending. The focus on expenditure reviews continued. The May speech mentioned over R300 billion reviewed since 2013, identifying R37.5 billion in potential savings. Underperforming programs are still targeted for closure or redesign in the 2026 MTE cycle.
Any new reforms mentioned?
New initiatives like data-driven payroll audits to find ghost workers, improving infrastructure planning processes, and reducing regulatory burdens were highlighted. Again, the need for strong political backing from the top was emphasized, along with the president's commitment to work with Treasury to cut wasteful spending. The division of revenue figures were reiterated. R2.4 trillion non-interest going to provinces over the MTF. R552.7 billion to municipalities. The provision of free basic services valued at R610 per month for 11.2 million poor households in 2025-26 was confirmed, and the link between quality municipal service delivery and their financial health was stressed again. Fighting corruption also remained prominent, mentioning the MPA's asset forfeiture unit strategy and money recovered recently.
Okay, and finally, infrastructure plans in the revised May budget. Any major changes there?
The overall scale and the main focus areas seemed largely consistent with March. Still around R402 billion for transport and logistics, R219.2 billion for energy, R156.3 billion for water and sanitation.
Minor shifts in the details, maybe.
Yes, some minor shifts in specific allocations within those sectors. For example, Central Roads funding was cited at R93.1 billion, PRASA at R66.3 billion, with R18.2 billion for rolling stock and R12.3 billion for signaling, which is slightly different from the R19.2 billion mentioned provisionally in March. The crucial need for maintenance was stressed again.
And the reforms to get private sector involved, PPPs, BFI.
Still key. The new PPP regulations are confirmed as effective June 2025. The BFI's quarterly proposal windows are going ahead, and the planned infrastructure bond issuance in 2025-26 was also reconfirmed.
Wow. Okay, what a complex and frankly turbulent journey from the March budget to the May one. Let's try and crystallize the most critical differences that emerge from this whole process, put them side by side.
Okay, the absolute biggest one, no question, is the VAT rate and the zero-rated items. March proposed the hike to 15.5%, then 16%, and linked that to expanding the zero-rated food basket. May keeps VAT flat at 15%, and because of that, the zero-rated expansion fell away. That's the headline change.
And the very legal context surrounding the budget presentation itself is fundamentally different between the two.
Completely. March was tabled as the government's intended fiscal plan. May was tabled explicitly acknowledging that a court order had set aside the previous parliamentary resolutions accepting that framework and had suspended the announced VAT increase. A very different starting point legally.
The amount of additional spending available for new things was significantly reduced.
Yep. That pool of funds for additional programs dropped from R232.6 billion over the MTE5 in March down to R180.1 billion in May. It's a R68 billion difference, directly linked to losing the anticipated VAT revenue.
Which naturally means the overall tax revenue outlook is lower in May.
Much lower. The May outlook projected R61.9 billion less tax revenue over 3 years compared to the March estimates. That reflects both the VAT change and that gloomier economic forecast.
And the strategy for bringing in new tax measures is now split some now, more later.
Exactly. March had the VAT increase as the main new measure for the period. May only includes the small fuel levy increase for 2025-26 and explicitly flags that R20 billion in new tax measures will be needed in the 2026 budget unless SARS hits those big collection targets.
Speaking of SARS, their funding and role were tweaked slightly too?
Yes, SARS got a slightly bigger additional allocation in May. R7.5BN over MTF compared to March R4BN, and was given those much more explicit debt collection targets, like hitting R35BN annually, partly to offset the need for future tax hikes.
The economic growth forecast for 2025 specifically is lower in May than it was in March.
Correct. Revised down from 1.9% to 1.4%.
And the point where government debt is projected to stabilize also shifted upward slightly.
Yes, projected to stabilize a bit higher at 77.4% of GDP in May compared to 76.2% in March. Though this was attributed mainly to lower nominal GDP projections, not necessarily more borrowing planned.
There are also those minor shifts we discussed in specific program details and the exact timing of grant increases.
Right, small adjustments in provisional allocations like for process signaling, the reconfiguration of the DRC troop funding, and that clarification on the phasing of the old age grant increase, splitting it between April and October in the May budget details.
And finally, the narrative and reflection on the whole budget process itself was much more prominent in the May speech.
Oh, significantly more. March had that brief mention of the initial postponement due to multi-party governance issues, but the May speech included a much more extensive reflection on the whole saga, the intense public and political debate, the court case, and the implications of these events for how the budget process works, and even for democracy itself.
So, after this whole roller coaster ride, what are the practical next steps? What happens now based on what the sources tell us?
Okay, well, based directly on that court order, one immediate legal step is the passing of legislation to regulate the VAT rate. That's the new rates bill the minister introduced, the one keeping VAT at 15%. While the court suspended the increase, that suspension is technically pending either this legislation being passed or a final ruling on Section 7.4's constitutionality.
Right, and that constitutionality challenged, to Section 7.4 itself, the mechanism for announcing tax changes.
That could still proceed. The DA specifically retained the right to pursue that challenge, so that separate legal process about the minister's power under that section might still play out.
Meanwhile, the government has to get on with implementing the revised May plan.
Exactly. The focus now shifts to actually implementing the spending plans and the reforms outlined in that May 21st budget. This includes pushing ahead with structural reforms, like those under Operation Volundula Phase 2, things like strengthening local government, improving digital infrastructure.
And the big infrastructure drive continues as planned.
Seems so. The plans for infrastructure investment are still there. That includes the new PPP regulations taking effect in June 2025, the BFI continuing with its quarterly proposal windows, and that government infrastructure bond issuance still planned for 2025-26. Other specific next steps mentioned include the review of active labor market programs and the future shape of income support, like the SRD grant. That review is still expected to be completed by September 2025. And discussions around the government's fiscal anchors, the long-term budget rules, are also ongoing.
And looking ahead to the next budget cycle already.
Yes, a critical part of the next steps is undoubtedly the preparation for the 2026 budget. That budget will have to grapple with proposing those new tax measures needed to raise that R20 billion, especially if SARS doesn't meet its ambitious targets for collecting outstanding debt.
Right.
The government will also need to figure out how to fund all those items listed in the speeches as needing support later down the line. And the consideration of guarantee support for Transnet is still explicitly mentioned as being on the table.
So definitely a process with many stages still to unfold, even after all this drama.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really traced the journey from an initial controversial proposal through a dramatic legal challenge and a swift reversal, leading to a revised financial blueprint. But the implementation, the ongoing reforms, and the preparation for those future fiscal adjustments, those are all the next steps that will continue to shape the country's financial landscape.
What a truly remarkable sequence of events it's been. From that proposed tax hike that sparked so much debate, through the courts forcing a rethink, leading to a complete reversal and a revised budget with, well, less room for new spending, all while trying to shield core priorities.
It really does illustrate that a national budget is anything but a static document. It's this dynamic process constantly being shaped by policy goals, political realities, legal frameworks, public reaction, economic conditions, all interacting, sometimes quite intensely in real time.
Absolutely. And reflecting on this whole saga, it's interesting. The minister in his May speech made a point. He suggested that the extensive debate and the legal challenges around this budget had actually given citizens, quote, unprecedented visibility into our democracy's evolution.
That's a fascinating perspective, isn't it? Seeing the nuts and bolts, the push and pull.
It is. So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive into the rapid, sometimes confusing, and certainly dramatic journey of South Africa's 2025 budget, Here's a thought to leave you with. What does this whole process, these twists and turns we've unpacked, reveal to you about how critical decisions concerning the nation's finances are actually made in the country right now?